Hi, welcome to VMRA Healing. This is Angie Schultz. Today I have Mark McNear with me, and he is a licensed clinical social worker in New Jersey with over 30 years experience. He is an author and a speaker. He's written this book, Finding My Words, A Ruthless Commitment to Healing Gently After Trauma. And so that is what we're going to talk about today, is his healing journey. So first off, Mark, do you mind sharing a little bit about yourself?
No, I'm a therapist, as you mentioned, a licensed psychotherapist. I live in New Jersey with my wife, Debbie, and I have been in practice for over 35 years now. And so I enjoy seeing patients, and I also enjoy speaking and writing. I've just started writing more, and that's been really good for me.
Do you have another book coming out?
No, this is enough for a while. I have been writing articles and things like that, though.
Okay. So I found it interesting that you stated that well, first off, do you mind just sharing a little bit about your history and what the book is about?
Sure. So there's three parts to the book. The first part of the book is that I go to rehab for substance abuse and other addictions. And the second part of the book I found when I was in rehab, people were asking me to tell my story, and I wasn't able to tell my story because I just didn't have the words for it. And that's really common for people that have had trauma. So the first part of the book is, not being able or finding my words. The second part of the book is speaking my words. And then the third part is embracing my words, or that's my recovery part of, kind of coming alive and starting to deal with and work through trauma.
And I know you credit God for a lot of your healing as well. Your faith was a big
Yeah,
part of it.
definitely. Definitely.
One of the things that I found interesting is that you felt that when your dad died, that gave you permission to start healing. Why do you think that was?
My dad was a big part of my life. And I talk about in the book, there were three things, but that was like really instrumental for me to go for help. And I think that, just psychologically, because there was so much abuse with him, that I think that once he passed away, it kind of gave me the permission or the go ahead or the coast is clear to be able to go and get the help that I needed and the healing that I needed.
I know that there's some famous celebrities actually who have talked about after their mothers had died about how abusive their mothers were, and it was like they had the freedom to do that. And then I remember Drew Barrymore saying that, it's a little bit harder because her mother is still alive and she loves her mom, but to also have to
Yeah, sure.
reconcile, and it's harder to find that healing while she's alive. And so I found that interesting because that seems to be a common thread that I have been hearing, not just with you. So you said at the end of chapter 1, God was right by your side in the darkest parts of my story, offering light, truth, mercy, and grace, though it was hard to see at the time. Looking back, how did you see him throughout those times?
I saw him through guiding me. It was not easy to see at that point in time because I was in so much pain. But, going ahead and then looking back and saying, this happened and then this happened and then this happened. And, my wife has been able to watch the things that have happened with me. And, she's pointed out, that one thing happened and I was able to go for that type of treatment or for that type of help. And then another door would open and then I would go for that type. And so, when you're in it, a lot of times you don't see it, or at least I didn't see it. But then fast forward, looking back at it, or even when I was writing the book, I could see step by step how he guided me in my journey. Definitely.
Another important thing that you stated, that the real problem was not actually your addiction. An addiction was the misguided attempt to deal with a real problem. So, how do you think someone like yourself can unearth what the true problem behind their addiction actually is? What helped you?
For me, and I read this quote by Gabor Mate. He's a physician and he deals a lot with trauma and addiction. And he wrote, and I'll paraphrase it, don't look at the addiction, look at the pain. And the way that I would translate it for myself is I really needed to look at, what was driving the addiction or what was driving my maladaptive behaviors. And that was, this desire to be able to self-soothe because I felt so dysregulated emotionally. And so for me, this journey has been, you know, um, looking at the addictions, but then also looking at, what was prompting them, or what was bringing them about. And for me, and I think the literature is pretty clear that for most people, addictions come as a result of trying to self-soothe or to calm oneself down.
It's interesting that you had talked about that you had trouble regulating yourself, and I know because that was actually one of my next questions. Was you talked about how you didn't learn how to self-regulate as a child because your parents weren't good at it themselves, and so how were you able to learn how to self-regulate as an adult, and what does deregulation, or however you pronounce that, what does that look like for somebody?
I think let me tackle first what dysregulation looks like. Dysregulation is when your mood is up and down and all around, and you have a hard time, focusing in or sitting with yourself. I talk a little bit in the book, but I'll go into more detail. I think things like, I mentioned taking a hot bath in the morning. That helps me. It helps my body to relax. Doing things like, drawing or coloring, doing mindfulness coloring can be really helpful for me. Sometimes tapping can be helpful. Talking with other people is something that's really, really helpful for me. Just kind of getting with somebody else and being able to talk with them about the way that I'm feeling, and just my thoughts and emotions is really, really helpful for me. Playing with putty, can be really helpful to help me to relax. So, I talk about with clients, I talk about, building a toolbox of things that work for them. And it's really interesting because what works for one person, like breathing, and that's another thing, is breathing is really helpful. Doing deep breathing, what helps one person doesn't necessarily help another. And so it's a matter of people customizing, their toolbox of what helps them to regulate emotionally.
You mentioned tapping in there, and I think not everybody knows what tapping is. Do you mind sharing a little bit
Yeah,
what
so
tapping is?
tapping can be something like just even putting your hands like this and alternating like that, do 50 of those or 100 of those, or doing that on your knees. That's another way to do it. Just helps regulate the body.
So you had mentioned that because of your complex trauma, that you had trouble speaking about about your past, and that's like a very common thing. People really have trouble talking about their past. Can you explain from a psychologist's perspective why that is?
The When you are going through trauma, there's two parts of the brain that like the whole brain is affected, but the two parts that play a big role in not having the words, there's a part called the broca, which kind of feeds language, and also the prefrontal cortex that helps you to think. And both of those go offline when you're in the middle of a traumatic situation. And so it's hard to have words or put words to what has happened to you. And so that's been part of the journey for me, being able to work on, constructing and figuring out exactly what happened to me. And a lot of times in the book, I'll talk about, I think I was about this age, or I think I was about that age. I don't know exactly, but I do know that these things happened. And so, part of the recovery process is also taking that into consideration, that some things are not clear. Some things, you remember parts of it, but not all of it.
I know one of my dearest friends, she had a very traumatic childhood, and she even, now that we're in our 40s, she's starting to uncover some things. And it's like there's stories that she has shared with me, and now all of a sudden she's starting to remember little bits and pieces that she didn't remember before. And it's almost like her body's ready to. And is there a reason for why it takes so long for people to be able to uncover some of those details?
I think that the body needs a sense of safety. You need to feel safe. And sometimes that comes with age. Sometimes, like you talked about earlier with the passing of my dad, that came for me. For me, I was asked by a counselor to type things up on a Word document. And it was interesting because the more I started putting things down, the more I remembered other things would come up. And I still have that happening today, where I will be doing something and something will pop into my mind and I'll be like, oh yeah, that happened. And usually it's something that wasn't very pleasant in my life. But now I think that, that I feel more emotionally stable and I feel bigger emotionally to be able to hold the story. And I think that when we start to, like with your friend, when we start to uncover things, we learn that we can handle them. And so the brain gives permission to give us that much more information about things that we've experienced.
That's very interesting. It, with the title of your book, Finding My Words, it's pretty obvious what that's about. But you also mentioned that in your book, words are powerful. They bring life and death. And so I found the parallel between, finding my words and that words bring life and death. How did finding your words bring life or death?
Well, it brought both to me. It as far as death, it really caused a lot of grieving for me to realize that I grew up in a home with that much abuse or that much trauma. It also brought a lot of life because I was willing to kind of start to let go of it, and I'm still in the process of it, and that's one of the things that I talk about in the book. It's not one and done. Trauma work is not okay. I'm going to work on it for the next 6 months and I'm done with it. You work on it every day and you regulate every day. You work on regulating every day. You work on processing things that come up every day. And for me, there's you know a lot of mourning, a lot of grieving that has come with looking at my story and looking at just how much pain there was.
I also noticed that you have a big emphasis on sharing your story as a part of healing. Um,
Definitely. When I first I started first reading the literature and trauma work, and it talked about sharing his story, and I was like, there's no way that I'm sharing my story, but it really does bring about freedom as you're able to share your story and share the difficult things. I shared a lot of difficult things in chapters 4, 5, and 6 of the book, as far as what I would be diagnosed with complex trauma, which is one trauma after another. It's a double-edged sword because on some level it brings a lot of pain, but then it also brings a lot of freedom and joy comes as a result of working on it.
when did you start to realize that what you were experiencing was different than what other people were experiencing at home?
Well, I always knew that it was a difficult situation growing up in my home, and I was naive about how much it impacted me, and so there was a certain amount of normalizing it and looking at it like, yeah, it was strange, but it really didn't impact me that much. And as I like went through life, I didn't realize how much it hurt me and how much I ended up hurting others as a result of it. And then, fast forward, I get into rehab at 55, and there was just this reality that hit me, that it's like, wow, I have really, really been traumatized. And, the subsequent years of healing after that have shown me, just how much trauma I've had. Some days it hits me more than others, and I'm kind of like, gosh, that was really hard to go through. I think that writing the book and being able to talk about the things gave a lot of freedom, but there's still a lot, that idea that the body holds the trauma is so true. And I feel it every day in my body. I feel it less now than, let's say, 5 years ago, but I still feel it.
When did you, because you did not go into rehab till 55. Well, at what age do you think your addiction actually started, and what age do you think you actually recognized that you had a problem?
I think that I was I got out of Bible college and I went from Northeastern Bible College to New York University. And so when I was going for my master's, I felt tons and tons of anxiety and depression. And so it was during that time that I got a referral to a psychiatrist, and he diagnosed me with ADHD. He diagnosed me with major depressive disorder, and he diagnosed me with panic disorder. Um, and so was given medication for those. And when I got the medication, it was kind of like, wow, this is what it's like to feel normal. And there was some truth to it. The problem was, you needed more medication, continued to feel normal. And so it wasn't long after that I was taking too much and taking over the counter medications and things like that to supplement to help me. to feel quote unquote regulated.
Do you, did you recognize that you were overusing it, or were you denying it to yourself?
Yeah, I denied it to myself. I remember my wife Debbie would say, "It seems like you're taking a lot of that," and I'd be like, "No, no, no, it's fine, it's fine." And one of the things I mentioned in the book is that the last person to realize it is the person that's addicted. And so, in rehab, it was kind of like, well, it really isn't that bad. But I didn't really like take into consideration. Here I am in rehab, needing to, be here in an inpatient setting to be able to go off this medication. That's how serious it.
I have a question that I've always wondered with ADHD. I also have ADHD, and it seems like a lot of people who have ADHD also have childhood trauma. Is there a connection, or is it possible that they're being misdiagnosed?
There's a lot of research out there, and there's a lot that indicates that some of it, some, no, emphasize some of it is maybe childhood trauma that looks like, because the person's dysregulated, that it looks like the person has ADHD. I got diagnosed with it when I was about 27 years old, and I definitely had the symptoms of it. The interesting thing is that since I've gone through this work and in recovery, I don't think that I have the diagnosis of ADHD. I definitely still have the anxiety, and I definitely still have, struggles with depression, but the ADHD, not so much. So I would be probably a case where I was misdiagnosed with ADHD when it was really complex trauma.
I just find that very interesting because there seems to be like a strong correlation. It's hard to tell if the symptoms are the same or if they're just one causes the other.
Certainly similar.
So you also talk about the difference between guilt and shame, and I know that's something that I've had to work through in my own life. That guilt is some. Can you explain the difference between guilt and shame, please?
The way I think the way I talked about it in the book is, guilt is something that you've done. Like you go into a store and you steal something and you come out and you feel terribly bad, or you feel guilty. On the other hand, shame is something that you just carry with you, as a result of feeling bad about yourself, feeling like there's something wrong with you, that there's you're defective in some way. And I think I've always felt that way.
I think it's often misunderstood too. Just because you feel shame does not mean that you were the person that did the thing that was wrong that causes you to feel that way. And that I think is often misunderstood. So I also love the quote in your book. It says, "It wasn't that I was pursuing God, rather, God was pursuing me." What caused you to say that?
Well, I think that with my addiction, I felt so far away from God, and I was in a mess. I mean, I was probably at my lowest and really felt horrible. Did not feel close to anyone or anything, including God. And so, here it is in March of 2015, and things, like I said earlier, lined up, one thing after another, one step after another, where I just saw God's hand move in my life. That before I knew it, I'm in inpatient rehab. And then I'm like saying in rehab, I'm never going to tell this story, you know, and just kind of wrestling with God with that and saying, no way, I'm not doing it. And then getting out of rehab and being drawn into different podcasts and different YouTube videos and, different treatment that really I saw his hand through it. I felt like, and I talk about this in the book, I felt like God was like fed up with me because I was in such a mess, and it wasn't true at all. I didn't realize at the time, but that's when he started really working, you know, um, in my life in a really impactful way that I could see. I'm sure he was working the whole time with me, but that in that particular way, I saw him working. And now looking back at it, almost 9 years later, I just see how he has guided me step by step.
You talk a lot about your support system. You don't actually use that phrase in there, but you talk a lot about your support system and the way that your wife responded and your daughter responded. Can you share a little bit about your experience of how they responded when you came home from talking to your psychiatrist?
Sure. So actually, I was home and I was on the couch, and I called the psychiatrist and I asked her for refills, and it became it quickly became obvious to her that I was abusing the medication. And so she said, I think you should go to rehab. Actually, she said, you need to go to rehab. And so I remember waiting for Debbie to get home. She teaches school. And so I had to tell Debbie about it. And Debbie was like, I think that's great. And I'm thinking, what? What's great? I'm on my way to rehab. And she's like, I think that that's really brave of you to be willing to do. And then I contacted my daughter Emily and got the same response from her. And that really gave me, a lot of initiative to really, pursue healing, to move forward with healing, to get the help that I needed. And then from there have been so many people that have helped me and walked through things with me, really difficult things that I don't think I could have walked through alone.
I know they say a lot of times the hardest part is coming home from rehab because you have this artificial environment where you have no access to what you're addicted to or anything like that. And then you have to come back to some of your old triggers and you may even have access to some of your old things. What was it like coming back from rehab?
Well, you're absolutely right. That is a hard transition, going from like safety to, a place that doesn't feel as safe. And for me, there was just so much anxiety, that I think that being around all the guys in rehab, I was really regulated being around them. And, we had a common pursuit to get, clean or get sober. And so coming home was hard for me. I don't feel like I was triggered with the same things. There wasn't medication there. It was very monitored and very carefully plotted out how I was going to deal with that. And a lot of the medications that I had taken before were not there, which was really really good for me. But just everyday frustrations that you face can be real triggers and can emotionally dysregulate you.
It seemed like your wife was a big help as well as you eventually were able to contact your daughter and she actually lived with you for a short time, it sounds like. How was that?
Yeah,
How was their response to you coming home?
was really wonderful. Debbie and I worked through things. We decided that she would work and that I would, really focus on recovery. And that's what I did. I went to intensive outpatient 3 times a week, and I went to individual counseling, and then I went to NA meetings, and I went to church, and just started getting back acclimating, with people. During the pandemic, Emily and Brandon, her husband, came and stayed with us, and that was just like a really good time of getting together and having them see the progress that I had made in my recovery. They've been really, really important to me in that.
That's really awesome. I just think you did a really great job in your book overall, just sharing your story, but also just kind of talking about the process of healing and the importance of healing. And I'm very proud of you for being able to do all that. So, what message do you hope people walk away after they read your book?
I think that I wanted to talk about a guy that, had a really traumatic childhood, who fell greatly from his values and didn't live by his values. And then by the grace of God, got back up and did a lot of work by the grace of God and has a good life now. And that no matter where you're at right now, no matter where you're struggling, that you can do that. I think that it's hard work. It's really scary. There's really hard days still, but that you can, you know, um, overcome. Addiction doesn't own my life. My childhood trauma doesn't own my life. Shame does not own my life. I have a new life now, and I really owe that to God.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I also just really appreciate your vulnerability in your book and on this podcast. And I just want to thank you yet again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to the Strength, Love, and Healing podcast with Authors Alcove. If you have written a book that could help others heal and would like to be a guest on our show, please go to theauthorsalcove.com to sign up. You can click on the podcast tab and click on Be a Guest. We always appreciate everyone who listens all the way to the end, especially if you could like, subscribe, and rate this particular podcast, that would really help us be able to reach more people. Also, our sister podcast, Authors Alcove, is over on Spotify and Apple Podcast. You can listen to that, where we talk with a lot of different writers about their writing process and their current books. Again, thank you very much. Hope you have a great day. God bless.